Hey, good morning, guys. It's Memorial Day. I just got back with KC last night. Like, literally just woke up. Like 20 minutes ago, just woke up. I feel like a lot of people on Memorial Day have a little bit of anxiousness in feeling guilty or kind of don't understand what the meaning of it is. I think the country's going through an identity crisis, but I feel like a little responsibility to kind of share some of my experiences and kind of my perspective on Memorial Day. When I was in the military as a young private in the Army, E1, I went to the 3rd Infantry Regiment in the 90s. I didn't want to go, by the way. I got screwed out of an Option 40 Ranger contract, like literally screwed. I still have the contract today that says Ranger Option 40. Which just means that after infantry basic training, you're supposed to go at that time to RIP, Ranger Indoctrination Program, and serve, if you make it, in Ranger Battalion. That's what I wanted to do. So this is the 90s, and the recruiter, unbeknownst to him, when he signed me up as an 11 X-ray. So I was in a platoon, a group of human beings, where they said, to the platoon to the left of us, you're Bravos. To the platoon in front of us, you're Charlies. And to the platoon that I was in, you're 11 Hotels, which is like anti-armor. It's like the 11 Bravos that get to drive in vehicles. Heavy weapons, 50 cal, Mark 19 at the time, all that good stuff. I didn't know any better. I just said, yeah, Roger, that's what you do when you're in the Army and you're a private. So I get through basic training, and they're doing unit assignments, and they assign me to 25th Infantry Division in Fort Lewis, Washington. And I'm like, what is happening? That's not what's supposed to happen because I'm supposed to be going to Ranger Indoctrination Program. I was a squad leader in basic training. I was at the top of my class. I had got promoted because they have a promotion program where if you show good leadership traits at the ripe old age of 17, I went from E1 to E2. I got like skeeter wings on my uniform. But the drill sergeant got mad at me. He said, why didn't you tell me that you had an option 40? And I'm like, I didn't know that I was supposed to tell you that I had an option 40 because there's no 11 hotels in Ranger Battalion. Only at the time, I believe, Bravos and Charlies, mortarmen and infantry. It's since changed. Who cares? That's that part of the story. But they literally said, hey, it sucks to be you. You're just going to have to do what you got to do. And I'm like, I have an option 40. And at the time, I had a Sergeant Major uncle who was pretty high in 18th Airborne Corps, had a lot of connections. And on our little phone break where we get like a phone call a day like we're in prison, I was able to call him and let him know. And he said, well, that's unsat, but it's kind of too late. Let me see what I could do. So he gets me into an office where there's an old guard recruiter that he recruited when he was a platoon sergeant there. And he said, yeah, man, I could do something for you. Your uncle took care of me when I was a Joe. I'm going to take care of you. And a guy knocked on the door, and it was a civilian. And civilians in the background in the military kind of run a lot of processes, especially administration processes. So he came in the room and he said, hey, where are your orders? And he had my orders, and it had 11 hotel and all the identifiers, and he crossed it out like with a ballpoint pen, like a U.S. government issued like ballpoint pen, crossed it out, wrote his initials, and wrote 11 Bravo. And I was like, what does that mean? And he goes, well, you're now 11 Bravo. Your secondary MOS is 11 Hotel. I'm like, what? And I'm like, am I going to battalion? No. The catch here is you have to transition into the old guard, the 3rd Infantry, where you can be 11 series, and then you put a 4187 and we'll cross-pollinate you over to Ranger Battalion. 4187 was just basically a request for transfer or move, and there was a lot of mythology around 4187. Hey, you just get there and you put a 4187. Well, I did that and it didn't work. Anyways, long story short, I get to a place I don't want to be. A ceremonial unit of the 3rd Infantry Regiment. They did have a scout platoon, which I was in for a period of time, that did Op 4, played the bad guy for Ranger Battalion, which is funny, and the rest of the old guard to keep their infantry skills, because we had to still maintain our Common Core skills at a base level as a requirement. We were also responsible for like QRF or riot control in the military district of Washington. So in the 90s, no war. And I'm like, okay, I'll be all I could be. I'll take advantage of the time. So I got my expert infantry badge, went to airborne school, went to Ranger school, and then I went to the Tomb of the Unknowns. So I joined to fight in the Army. I didn't join to sit around. I didn't join for college. I joined because I was like, I grew up playing war, watching war, and my dad was in the Army. I wanted to be in war. And at the time, if he said that, is people were like looking at you like you're crazy, and I just didn't understand it. But I wasn't in the right culture, because cultures like battalion, cultures like Special Forces, for the Army side at least, were fighters. And they weren't afraid to say they were fighters. So I was in a position where I had to do something as a specialty, so I tried out for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Had really no idea, besides my uncle was a tomb guard, how difficult it would be. 7 to 9 months of training, the most difficult training to this day of anything that I've ever done in my life. The discipline, attention to detail, and the focus that you had to have to be perfect, because my standard will remain perfection, which is line 6 of the Sentinel's Creed, was true. More importantly than I would say the technical experience of being a tomb guard, the humbling experience of doing that job was pretty profound for a young soldier in the military who went to the Tomb of the Unknowns, I think, at the age of 18 years old. So I'm an 18-year-old tomb guard, and I'm guarding the Tomb of the Unknowns, which is, I think, the world's most sacred shrine that has the World War I, World War II, Korean, Vietnam unknowns. Men, likely men, at this time combat arms didn't allow women, so men who went overseas to serve their country and not only paid the ultimate sacrifice, but they gave their identity. Like, that's a big deal. They came home in Ziploc bags and bone fragments and were buried in an unknown crypt, and we created this Tomb of the Unknowns in Arlington National Cemetery, which I think is like, you know, like some people say we should have it all draft military, like you should do mandatory service. I wouldn't go that far, because a lot of people don't need to be in the military. But what I would say is, like, as a mandatory history lesson, as part of your curriculum, you should go to the Arlington National Cemetery, and especially the Tomb of the Unknowns. Walking back and forth as the technical job, 21 steps, hill click, face DC, 21 seconds, and repeat times every single hour of every single day, 24/7, rain, snow, sleet, heat, is the least that we could do for the men who went overseas and sacrificed it all. So it taught me a lot. It gave me a lot of, I think, perspective in my own suffering, where I do a stress shoot. Me and Casey did a stress shoot in San Bernardino, and there's like a guy who's like moaning and groaning, doing 5 minutes of calisthenics. It's like, dude, you're doing exercises with your physical body, pushing and pulling your own body weight when it's 75 degrees in California, which, I don't know, it's kind of like Baghdad, in the middle of freedom. Again, it's like Baghdad. California's like Baghdad. But I look at that and I go, my sacrifices and suffering pale in comparison to the sacrifices made by human beings who never came home, whose mothers and fathers were told they don't know where they are, but they haven't been able to find them, and likely they will never be found. Were they killed in action? Were they missing in action? I mean, the numbers are profound. From World War I, which is kind of out of sight, out of sound for most people, World War II, 41 to 45, Korea, 50 to 53, the Vietnam War, we left tens of thousands of Americans behind enemy lines that we completely abandoned. So when I was sweating in a wool uniform, feeling sorry for myself, all it took was a glance in my peripheral to look at a crypt of human beings who sacrificed it all. And it gave me some good perspective. Fast forward in the, me in the global war on terror, losing a lot of buddies. I just looked at it upstairs. I have a leather bracelet that I made when I was going through a difficult time that has 11 friends that I lost. Like human beings that I interacted with. I knew their parents. I knew their wives. I knew their best friends. They were really close to me. 11 human beings that I etched their name with a handmade leather tool to remind me of their sacrifice. Or the bracelet says, never forget. And I don't want to forget. My son is named after 2 former teammates that were killed. One killed in a tragic accident that I talk about often at Fieldcraft Survival, and one that was killed overseas as a team sergeant leading men into war, doing what men do, what men should do, lead. So when I see Americans and I see social media and I see the things that people are trying to do, there's a disparity. There's people saying like, you shouldn't be doing anything but Murph, or you shouldn't be doing anything but remembering the sacrifices. A lot of people are far disconnected from that sacrifice because they don't know what that means. And I'm not one to judge those human beings, especially young people who really don't understand. I dated a gal once who said, we need to do Murph. And I'm going to do Murph with my girlfriends. And she would virtue signal to the world that she was doing this workout. And I said, do you know what Murph is? She's like, yeah, it's a workout to honor those who passed away. And I was like, do you know who Lieutenant Michael Murphy is? And she's like, oh, I didn't even know it was named after a person. So she was out virtue signaling that she was doing this thing more about taking pictures of themselves and working out than actually remembering or honoring the sacrifice of somebody passed away. But it's like people don't know. So here's just my short take on it. One, Memorial Day is a very personal experience. If you're a veteran like me and Casey who have lost a lot of team guys, I'm about to get on a podcast here and talk about some of that, then it's different. But I also come from a line of human beings that would not want you to, mull it over. Like walking around getting wasted off of bourbon, talking about sacrifice and feeling sorry for yourself. I come from a great line of human beings who paid the ultimate sacrifice doing what they love and would say, dude, what are you doing? Go out and exercise those freedoms and live your best life and stop feeling sorry for yourself because that sacrifice that I made was so you could exercise those freedoms. So I'm somewhere in between. It's like exercise the freedom, just have some perspective and some respect. I see people social media posting about their cell or posting about their next training course. It kind of bums me out a little bit because, some of those guys, I'm like, but maybe they just don't know better. It's like you post about the next cell because you want to make money, and maybe you forgot it's Memorial Day because you want to forget about it. I think we need to be somewhere in between. Live your best life, exercise in freedom, but remember that the reason you're able to exercise those freedoms are because the men and women who were willing and made this sacrifice in all its totality, leaving their families behind so you could do that. I think we often forget that. More people are disconnected from that experience than ever before. We also know statistically, if you serve this country, it's likely you come from a long line of service. So it's exclusively, the majority are families who have been sharing that burden. So a lot of people don't know. Don't judge, educate. If you have an experience, maybe take the time to educate. I educated at the time my ex and said, hey man, let me tell you about Lieutenant Michael Murphy because I was there in country when this happened. And he was a well-respected Navy SEAL officer who stood out in the open, made the call, even though under fire he likely knew it meant he potentially could be killed. And he paid the ultimate sacrifice. So talk about and share the experiences of guys you serve with, gals you serve with, who did pay the ultimate sacrifice, and remember it. But don't mull it over. Don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't feel sorry for their families, because their families are more resilient. And unfortunately, those families were put in that position. They had to become resilient because it was sink or swim. And they got through it. Those families, remember, are breaking bread together, and their experience is very different than yours. You know, while it's less connected because we got some distance, time, and space, for them, it is a very intimate moment where everything hits them, and it's difficult. I know it because I have people texting me about how difficult it is. I want to say, you know, Memorial Day is a time of reflection, but it's also a time, it should be a time that you're spending with loved ones, reminding them of that sacrifice. When I call my son's name, it is a small reminder with a huge person that played an impactful role in my life. Don't forget that people have those shared experiences, and it's a thing. Our country is free because of those sacrifices. Our country is free because of those men and women who are willing and able to make the ultimate sacrifice. I hope you remember it. I'm just here to remind you. I thought I'd share that with you before I get on this podcast and talk about some of those teammates. I hope you have a good day, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. We'll kick off Prep Life later on this week. Thanks, guys.